someone will tell us if we're actually live, which I firmly believe we are live. Yeah.
This is the opening of every one of your shows, Jason.
Man, like, are we here, guys? Could somebody please tell me? I don't have faith. Like, that little button says we're live, but I don't entirely have faith in anything. So, hey, everybody in the chat or who's joined us. Before we get started, since this is a somewhat heavy topic, I wanted to suggest to all of you, our buddy Jason Ursi, his Santa Maybe a Criminal came out today. I think it's like the second to last episode of his awesome true crime satire podcast. So after you finish listening to us, go over to Santa Maybe a Criminal, download that as a palate cleanser for all the heavy topics that we're talking about today. You will enjoy it. So are you guys ready to go? I can go ahead and get us started with the intro if you're cool with it. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to thank all the Silver Linings Handbook, Murder Sheet Patreons, Dana's listeners for joining us tonight for a conversation about journalism, journalistic ethics, and true crime. I'm joined, if you guys don't know them, by Kevin Greenlee and Áine Cain of the Murder Sheet podcast, which is a true crime podcast based on original reporting, and Dana Pohl, a researcher and journalist who's both a co-host on Seeking Justice, which is a YouTube channel where they're investigating a very interesting case, and her own podcast, True Crime P.I, where she researches cold cases. At a time when the news industry is really under siege and we see quality publications going out of business on a monthly basis, and true crime has also grown in popularity and sort of spread in terms of its methods of delivery, we thought it would be important to explore the intersection of journalism and true crime and what the responsibilities are of all creators, whether you're a journalist, an entertainer, an advocate, or an analyst. Several alarming trends have emerged in true crime from my perspective. You can see it in the coverage of the murders of 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Libby Germain in Delphi, Indiana, the prosecution of the alleged killers at the University of Idaho, and several other cases. Creators with limited experience researching and reporting news or diving into covering news in a way that doesn't always include the appropriate context, isn't always accurate, and sometimes does harm that's not necessary. That's not necessary to really provide people with the information they need to know. In several cases, such as Delphi, Idaho, and the murder of John O'Keefe in Canton, Massachusetts, creators covering the cases have inserted themselves so deeply that their work has become central to the case themselves. In Massachusetts, where a woman named Karen Reed is on trial for killing O'Keefe, a blogger covering the case has been charged with many counts of witness intimidation. In Idaho, a TikToker falsely accused a professor of murder, leading to threats and harassment for that professor. And in Delphi, the defense attorneys are facing contempt charges for violating a gag order and have been accused of both using creators as sources and leaking to them in an effort to affect the jury pool. In Delphi, it's hard at times to tell whether certain creators are working for the truth and for their listeners, or for the defense team, or to ensure the conviction of the defendant. Several documentaries in the true crime world, including The Staircase and Making of a Murder, have come under intense criticism for shading the truth to the point of functionally lying. In many ways, this is a throwback to days before Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein broke the Watergate story that took down President Nixon, to a day when yellow journalism reigned supreme. A time when certain newspapers that presented little or no legitimate, well-researched news instead used eye-catching headlines to increase their sales. Now it's just happening on podcasts and YouTube channels. In many ways, the internet has brought a democratization of journalism. No longer do you need to own a printing press to decide who's allowed to tell the news. It has it has taken down many barriers for all sorts of people to become journalists. It's brought them low, but journalism is a trade and a craft. And as we've seen, not everybody can do it well or is well equipped to do it. And now listeners are left to be their own gatekeepers with no idea how to figure out who to trust. Today, we want to discuss journalism ethics, some of the current issues the space is facing, what creators can do in order to be better at it and to better serve listeners, whether those are people paying attention to true crime or otherwise, and how listeners can find the accurate type of reporting that will really help them become more informed citizens. Most of you guys know I'm Jason Blair. If you're listening right now, you probably know that. I'm the host of the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm a former journalist for the New York Times. In 2003, I resigned from my job at the Times because of a plagiarism and fabrication scandal that I'm responsible for. The Times at the time called it a low point in its 150-year history. From that, I've gained an appreciation for the risks of pride, I guess, and not working on your character because of the impact on the profession that I love so much, a profession that I really believe has the power to heal people, the power to help people, and the power to entertain people. Through all of that, I've maintained an appreciation for the power and the importance of journalism and what it brings into the world. And the only time I go back and discuss that scandal in any depth is when I'm going to go talk to journalists or journalism students. I've also gained an amount of compassion through that experience and understanding for people, and recognize some of what we're struggling with in the industry right now are simply honest mistakes. At the same time, I recognize that not all bad behaviors we're seeing are because good people are doing bad things, and that there are indeed bad actors out there who would cash in on truth for clicks. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let my guests introduce themselves. I'm going to go ahead and start with Kevin first.
Okay. I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney, and I work with Áine here on the Murder Sheet. She's my wife. It's True Crime Podcast. And I was really struck by what you were saying. This is just a little bit off topic, but it's relatively close, so bear with me. A number of times people in life do things, they make mistakes, and it's important to understand that you can get through that. And you're an example of that. And we're going to be talking tonight about internet mobs sometimes and what that's like when you see people get riled up. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately because I host a true crime podcast, but I'm basically a comic book guy. And in the comic book world, there's a story going on now where a cartoonist named Ed Piskor was accused of sending inappropriate texts to young girls. And he felt that he was being targeted by an internet mob, and he ended up taking his own life. And so it's important to just remember there are real people on the other end of the screen. And whether someone's done something that deserves censure or whether they don't, we need to extend compassion and grace and not make people so unhappy and stressed out that they feel there's no way out other than taking their own lives. And I'm sorry to be off topic.
I don't know that that's entirely off topic, because I think that probably applies to some of the creators in the space, but also, so many things, it's hard to think of something that's more sensitive than crime. There are sensitive things in life, but, I wasn't going to talk about this, but this weekend I went to Delphi. And part of the reason why I went to Delphi was because I wanted to become grounded again in the real human beings, and including the victims themselves, because so many of the debates are so far afield from it. And it was just very interesting to be there in that very small space and imagine the real human beings and go through the town and see the real people who were being affected by this. And it's not just the victims and their families, it's everyone in that space is being affected by it. And, I've always thought as a journalist, be careful with my words, right? Be careful with that fact that may, to me, seem really interesting, but might be really, really harmful to another person. It's not necessary to tell a story. So I think it both applies to journalism, it applies to true crime, that I think operating with grace and compassion, even for people you might not like or upset about, is the right way to go, because I don't think we should be creating, whether we're listeners or whether we're commenting on social media, we're in our positions, unnecessary harm. Áine?
Who are you?
Who am I? Hi, I'm Áine Cain. I'm Kevin's wife, and he's my husband. And I'm also the co-host of the Murder Sheet. And yeah, I'm a journalist by trade. I basically worked in business journalism for a while before this, and sometimes I feel like coming into this and doing more, crime-oriented journalism in a new media has been a bit like going through the looking glass, or maybe, like that, when the Back to Future movies, when they go back and then they mess up and then they go back and like it's a dystopia, like it sort of feels like there's a lot of interesting stuff and not really some of the professional standards that exist in more traditional media spaces. And I think that's a challenge, but I think that's a challenge that a lot of really wonderful creators, could kind of rise to and try to, maybe all professionalize the space a little bit more, so that we're, doing our listeners and viewers a good service and, not messing things up, I guess.
Yeah. And I think, and that's another thing to take into consideration. So much of this is so new, and not just in true crime, but the mediums and the barriers coming down, and then extending people a little bit of grace, because some people, and I've run into this like in some conversations with creators that have been really good, or good conversations where they've said to me, I had no idea that it was this hard. It seems very simple on the outside, but I had no idea. And so, Dana?
So I'm going to do just my traditional spiel of saying that I am a cold case researcher and advocate. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh. I earned a degree in journalism and communications from Point Park University, and a master's in library and information science from University of Pittsburgh. So those two things together spell I am super fact-based, and I wouldn't think of telling a story unless I was 99.9% sure it was the truth, or it is the truth. I am the producer and host of True Crime P.I. podcast, and I'm 1/3 of Seeking Justice, the YouTube investigative series where we have others tell the story, experts tell the story, so that we are inviting very factual content into our series. I discovered my passion for cold case advocacy in 2005 when I began researching missing and unidentified person cases. And my goal really has always been to help find the missing, give the unidentified back their names, and provide answers to families who I feel have been forced to carry the unbearable burden of not knowing. So when you have that as your goal, to me, it makes it easy. I have no other goal. And so I am always moving forward, trying to help and not harm.
Yeah. And I think that's another point, like knowing what your North Star is.
Mhm.
There's so many, and I think about this sometimes when we have conversations, Kevin and I, there's so many really difficult decisions to make when you're doing this kind of work. So many close calls, and like having some element of some overriding value that's driving you is probably super important to being able to do this.
Yeah, I think also interrogating to ensure that you're living up to whatever that value is. I think sometimes it can be easy to kind of like, oh, I'm doing the right thing, this is great, and talking to people you respect, looking at other journalists who you respect and see what they're doing. Those can be great ways to ensure that you're living up to whatever that standard is.
Keeping yourself accountable. I was gonna start by asking you, Dana, just a little bit about, you had brought up your experience researching cold cases and how that drove you. And I know when you came on, we talked about like you being young and seeing the faces, the milk carton faces of the missing children. I was going to ask you just sort of from your perspective, how did you get into this work? Why did you get into this work? Why did you choose to do the kinds of cases you did, and sort of like what kind of changes you've seen over the time?
So I think it's a multitude of things. I mean, I think, I call myself a who, what, when, why child, which was very, challenging for my parents. But I was always very curious. I did grow up during the milk carton era. I would be eating my breakfast every morning and I read a lot. And so whatever was in front of me. So I would see the milk cartons and the many faces of the missing children. And I was shocked by that. I think in my little world, I really wasn't thinking that children went missing and families didn't know where they were, and sometimes they never came home. And so I think that combined with my curiosity, I loved reading mysteries and I loved, writing and all that sort of thing. And so I pursued journalism. Then I go off to become a librarian, and the internet is all of a sudden, turning to broadband and no longer dial up, and it's becoming a tool that we can all use. And so once that happened, I started doing my family's genealogy and looking into just researching cases that I found on the internet. I was looking at cases of people local to me when I first started. I was using databases like the Doe Network and the Charlie Project, and making matches or trying to make matches, trying to figure out what happened to a local missing girl. And while doing that, I discovered Web Sleuths, which at the time was one of the only places you could kind of meet up and have a discussion about these cases. And people there at the time were very kind to one another. Like we all, no, none of us thought we were experts. None of us were experts. We really had no idea what we were doing. We were just doing our own independent research and then deciding that, let's talk about it. Let's share ideas. I'd put up a match and say, do you think this is possible? So it was a really friendly, welcoming environment for many years. And then, as we've moved through time, we've also had the invention of social media and multiple platforms, which gives everyone the opportunity to share their opinions and their thoughts. And that's great in some ways, but it also, I feel, has a way of making people think they're experts in just because they have an opinion, and they deliver their opinions as if they are experts. And I mean, I've said this multiple times in private, but I'm going to say it now in public. Not everybody is or should be or can be an expert. That is reserved for people who are either educated or experienced in that area, and that you can draw upon those things to share educated guesses, your thoughts, but being respectful of others in those environments, to me, is the one thing that has changed tremendously over
Hmm.
the years.
What do you mean by that? That it's dismissed, expertise is dismissed a little bit more, or?
Expertise is dismissed a little bit more, and it's devalued because people assume roles that they have not actually earned. Um, so whether it's through education or, like I said, experience, that, we sometimes think that we're smarter than law enforcement. We sometimes think that we're smarter than prosecutors. We sometimes think that we're smarter than, I mean, just about there literally every day I read something where I'm like, I don't know why you think like you can say that when I know you have no real basis for that. You have no expertise. You really have no education in that area. It's become it's almost like people have in their minds leveled the playing field. So everybody's equal.
Yeah. Because you made me think of something there that, like as a reporter, you cover all sorts of different topics, but, in trying to get something like an autopsy report took so much work and, jumping through hoops and trying to get it. But you didn't just write about the autopsy report. You went and you talked to somebody who understood autopsies and pathology and could translate it for you to be able to speak to your audience. But now all of that stuff is really readily available. I remember looking at an autopsy report recently and I was like, oh, those are needle marks looking at it. And one of our listeners, I didn't say this on there, this was just in a private chat. One of our listeners who works in medical profession said, no, that was the EMTs. The EMTs did all that. That was marked by that. They knew just by looking at the way that the circles were drawn that was the EMTs. And there is, yeah, and I see it with you guys, Kevin and Áine. There's a value to tapping into that expertise.
Absolutely. Yeah. We like to think of ourselves as like more of students with this, because even though we have a law and journalism background, Kevin was never a prosecutor. I was never some sort of like investigative crime beat reporter. And so we might have some tools that we can use to analyze things, but we'd much prefer to talk to somebody who's like an expert. And I think like Dana was saying, like that has been undervalued. But so many times people are thinking emotionally, or they'll say, oh wow, this legal brief seems really explosive, and then you talk to somebody who has years of criminal defense background and they're able to say, actually, here's why this makes sense strategically. And I think there's so much more value in that. And I mean, maybe that's a way for folks to think about and engage with this stuff more as students and less as self-proclaimed experts, where they're coming in and saying, I already know everything.
And we're very fortunate. We have an outstanding audience, just a brilliant audience. So if something comes up that we don't know about, something obscure, from a point of the law to a make or model of a car, literally all we have to do 99 times out of 100 is to say on the show, well, we don't know what this means. Can someone out there who does let us know? And experts will reach out to that so we can share it with the audience.
And Dana and Jason, you both know this because you have the experience, studying journalism and doing journalism. But like, there's nothing more powerful than, I don't know, can you explain this to me? A lot of people don't want to say that. It's a little bit embarrassing. You want to think you're smart. You don't want to have to ask for help. But that's the power of journalism, where you're actually just like,
no, I'm really smart at getting you to tell me what I want. I'm not smart at anything else.
Give me your information, please. Give me your, give me your spells, Mr. Wizard. I mean, like, that's kind of what it is. And there's when you're not well versed in how to do that, it looks more like becoming a pundit, or like, I know everything, let me tell you. It's like, that's my hackles always go up when it is a creator that's like kind of more of assuming the role of expert of all things, because it's like most of us are really good at like one area, and like how, like
if we're lucky.
If we're lucky.
Yeah. I think anyone who knows me will tell you good at nothing. But
no.
Mediocre at a lot of things.
What happened to truth in journalism, Jason? Come on, you're great.
You're wonderful.
Just not about myself. One of the things I think a lot of people know, you were my introduction to podcasting, really, Kevin and Áine. And one of the things that, stuck out to me when I was listening to your podcast, okay, these guys are reporting, they're talking to experts, they're reviewing documents. And I walked in thinking that, okay, most podcasts are going to be like this, most true crime podcasts. And I definitely ran into a couple like Your Own Backyard by Chris Lambert, where there's actual reporting. But I was actually shocked that so many of them really weren't. They weren't going beyond you know, reading some stories or picking, and it was very disappointing to me, I guess, in the beginning. And I was always curious, did you guys walking into this know that there was a need for more of a journalistic approach to it, or is it just who you are?
Oh God. Well, I think probably like we kind of were thinking about doing something more casual when we were first thinking about a true crime podcast. That's what Kevin had in mind when he sort of pushed for it, and I was just like, I don't want to do any of this. And I think what made us realize that our value add is not charisma or humor. We recorded just like a kind of a practice episode where we just talked about a case that we both researched, and it was the most. I mean, if you think we're awkward and cringy now, and then like if this tape ever gets out, we're done. I mean, like we'll have to leave.
We realized charisma, personality, these aren't our strong suits.
No.
So if we're going to do this, we should use our strong
We have to be
suits.
really nerdy about it. We have to be really journalistic. And I think we had both listened to so many true crime podcasts at that point that we were beginning to see that like this could be an interesting blending of an old school approach to journalism, but also a new school medium, and what we could have some interesting things with that. And so I think we it kind of worked out, but I think it was largely at first more of an accident just because we were total awkward weirdos. But yeah, I think I said like we're better at like research and finding things out than talking to people. So
And I'm curious, how have people like your listeners or listeners in general, how have they responded to that? And I bring this up because of one thing that I've been thinking about lately. Recently there have been some, attacks on you guys. Periodically there are attacks. And I'm like, and I've thought to myself, what are the common threads? And one of the things that I've really realized in true crime as of late, and maybe this is true about politics too, in other areas, there seems to be this drive for people to pick sides. And the side you guys seem to have picked is the truth, which means that you're on neither of the sides. So you're like on this island, quite alone.
Yes.
Getting hit by missiles from both sides. So I'm just curious how your listeners have responded to the approach. Do they notice?
That's a really good, first of all, thank you for the lovely compliment. Yeah, we kind of we kind of don't occupy like a team in cases we cover, and certainly not in the most high profile one, which is Delphi. And it's definitely, I think a lot of people do appreciate that because they don't want this to be a football game. They want it to be like, what is happening? Can you tell us what you think, or what you found out, or what this expert says? And I think probably the majority of people prefer that because they would rather, we'll give our opinions, but we're never going to try to spin you for this side or that side, which is not the case in many other situations. I'll just say, like, other people have said, this is my team. I will hype them up, and that's what I'm going to do, which is, you're not going to get a full picture from that. We've basically taken the approach of we don't care who we tick off. Like, we'll just be kind of agents of chaos and say what we think and cover what we uncover and be responsible about reporting it, but also not like concerned about, what's good talking points for one side or another. We've tried very much to stay out of that line of thinking even, but I think some people like it. And then some people really hate it. I mean, they want you to pick a side, and they're annoyed that if they perceive you as reporting anything that is not favorable to their side.
I'll be very honest. There are times you mentioned we're the subject of a lot of attacks, and there are some criticisms that are honestly made and constructive, and those are always welcome. And then there are other like criticisms of our work, which frankly are fictitious. They're like they will accuse us of suppressing things that we actually released as soon as we got, and that comes out a lot. And then there is people who say they hate us so much we need to be taken care of, like post pictures of our home, There are people who Anya's been very open about being a recovering alcoholic,
That was a mistake.
and so
I don't.
there are people who discuss her alcoholism in unflattering ways and make up stories about things that allegedly happened to her in the past. There are people who like photoshopping pictures of us. There's like a gentleman, I'd say gentleman. There's a person who like photoshopped an image of fecal matter onto Anya's pants.
Yeah, it was like, what?
There's
Where are you
there's
having this
a
time?
lot of negative talk about our appearances. We're both ugly. So yeah, there's recent attacks suggesting I won't even go
Yeah,
into what
no.
it suggests. But it's not fun. It's not
I'll just-
pleasant.
it just-
but
yeah.
I will say it is gratifying when these attacks reach a certain level that people do remind you that they have your back.
I will just say also, I'll just say this. It's just really surreal sometimes. It's not pleasant, but it's surreal and almost amusing at times because I always just picture, what would this be like in like the business journalism world? Like I'm just think of like the silliness of thinking of like a Wall Street Journal reporter openly beefing and photoshopping stuff onto a New York Times reporter, and then maybe someone from Bloomberg doxes an editor at Business Insider. You just wouldn't see that,
It would be absurd, right? Among the creators. I mean, the only time from my time in journalism where I could say like, one example, the foreign editor, and I actually think this was a great point. The foreign editor at the time, when I was in New York, was a former Jerusalem correspondent, and used to say, look, if either side is happy with me, I'm doing a bad job. And it came at a cost, right? Like when the only time where time security had to come in and intervene for me, and they wanted to call the NYPD, it came from the NYPD Intelligence Bureau, was when I wrote a story about a confidential or a controversial topic related to the Jewish Defense League. And so there were topics that were hot button enough that it could get pretty hot. But it certainly seems now that certainly on some of these high profile cases, it's happening increasingly. And social media allows you to go at people and find out things about them and do things that are the super concerning. As somebody who's been on the other end of the same things that you have been on, possibly today on Twitter myself, but and I guess kind of like what I guess the hypothesis that I'm wondering about is the real offense, right? That you're not picking sides, that you're searching for a kind of truth. And sometimes in my narrative, I may want this outcome or that outcome. And that search for the truth is what's, I guess, leading to some of that criticism.
I think some people seem very, very overtly threatened by any sort of independent, neutral voice in the case, because that is perceived as possibly influential and it can't be controlled. And I think that, I don't want to, I'm not trying to be like, oh, we're truth tellers and people have to take us down. But like that, I don't know why else some of these people would do any of this, because it's like,
So
it seems like a lot of time and effort.
Well, let me flip the other side, right? A lot of people have been very upset recently about, they watch things like The Staircase about Michael Peterson, or they watched Making of a Murderer, and you found out that, let's say, facts may not have been included, or there may have been other issues, but I feel like that it's the same crowd is just as mad that they were duped in a story that's kind of like attacking you guys for doing the truth. So I think there's something to this, like, having to pick a side that is almost giving listeners the opposite of what they really want in the long run, which is just the truth. What happened? So, if that makes sense. So I wanted to ask you something, Dana. We had talked about this before, but you had mentioned to me that there's a reason why you picked the kinds of cases that you do and aren't sort of like diving into the current cases. What's that?
So I used to think that the only reason why was because they were my peers. So I was picking people from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and those were people when I was growing up, those were the people that could have been my friends. But lately I'm thinking that, I like to be, first of all, an individual in the work that I do. I don't like to jump on a bandwagon or, just kind of get involved in something just because everybody else is doing it. And in cases that are and I like to do things that other people aren't doing. So when I started my podcast, there were less podcasters talking about cases that were older than there are now. So cold cases were a little less popular at the time, and everybody was talking about solved cases, just telling the story and that sort of thing. So I wanted to bring in my investigative side. I wanted to, be able to research and bring new information to the table. But as we've seen these big cases kind of hit the news and grow into this big giant, thing of their own, I realized that it's not my spot. I don't want to jump in there and fight for space or argue an idea, a thought or a theory, because first of all, these are very new cases. For me, law enforcement's doing whatever they're doing. So let's just say the Idaho case. Law enforcement was doing what they were doing. People are getting involved. Are they doing more harm than good? Not always. So all of that just seems like chaos to me. And if you think about what my goal is, it just doesn't fit. I'm interested privately. I will listen, to news on the case. I will try to stay abreast of what's happening. But I don't want to dive into any discussion groups or have conversations about it. And I think some of it could be that I'm not a real competitive person. And environments like that make me nervous. You know what I mean? It's just like everybody's coming at everybody with a comment or a thought, and it just is not comfortable to me to be in a space like that.
Where you don't feel like you can necessarily do your best work in that
Right.
environment, which also begs the question, like how as a creator in this space, the highly competitive space, Kevin and Anya, what is it emotionally like for your day to day? Like I feel like on some days I'm like, oh, Kevin and Anya are gonna have an easy week, and then by midnight I'm like, okay, well they're gonna have like 9 episodes by Thursday.
My thought is, I think Dana had it right.
Yeah, sure, Francis.
That sums it up. It's it's a lot. It's and in some ways we're privileged by our medium that we can cover the case far more granularly and nimbly than traditional media outlets. So I feel like the competition there, we're just doing such different things. Like TV news isn't going to get out there and do like, okay, well, here's what this one filing means, but we can. But just all of the constant noise and drama, frankly, oftentimes very silly drama, is definitely a lot to contend with. And we've had to, at times like just kind of decompressed, attempted to decompress.
Step back a little bit.
But also, we really love our audience, and we feel we have an obligation. If they have questions about what's going on in the Delphi case or any of the other cases we cover, we feel like we have an actual obligation to help explain it and help them understand. I remember one time there was a filing in the Delphi case, and I don't even recall which one it was, but Áine and I talked about it. So we're not really sure if we should even bother to do an episode. And then I go on the gallery, which of course is the Facebook group devoted to the excellent podcast prosecutors. And there was a comment on there from somebody saying, well, I don't know if I understand this current filing in the Delphi case, but I'm sure Kevin and Áine are going to hop on and explain it to us right away. So I said, we better do it, Áine.
Prosecutors want us go. They say jump, we say how high.
Gallery is a great group, by the
They're
way.
a great group, yeah.
And if you're not a member of that group, I recommend it. And if I imagine everybody watching this listens to the gallery, listen to the prosecutors rather, but if not, you should.
Yeah. One of the things that I've long thought of, just having been somebody who grew up in journalism and saw all of its awesome powers, as an industry, it's struggled. Like some people might say that for the last 15 years, the truth has really struggled a lot too. But journalism has always struggled with covering crime, period. Right? Who we choose to cover, who we don't choose to cover. I remember recently I was researching for a guest who was coming on to talk about his daughter who went missing and was murdered, right? And she was young, but she was also Native. And so I was looking into missing, murdered Native women in that particular area. And I started my broad search of missing and murdered people, and I could see the length of the articles for the differences in the links of the articles for missing people. I could see other things like that just stuck out to me in coverage, and I was more used to that certainly in working in big cities. Similar issues came up, and I feel like those are challenges we're all still struggling with, including this new creator space. But one of the awesome things about this new creator space, right, on the more positive side, is if I am going to go find a story about some inner city kid or a Native woman who went missing, I'm going to find it on a podcast or a YouTube channel. I'm not necessarily going to find it on a newspaper. So, that's the positive side of it for me, that this has given us an ability to shine light on things that there just wouldn't have been for an assortment of different reasons, an opportunity to shine a light on. The other side is documentaries, YouTube channels, anyone being able to be a creator has presented new challenges. And, Dana, you talked about all the research you do. Kevin and Áine, you talk about the reporting you do. But as a listener on the outside, you don't necessarily know the difference between you and anyone else until you really get into it. So I'm just curious from your perspective, what do you view as the challenges, and what advice would you give to listeners in figuring out, because as humans, the one non-renewable resource that we have, the one that advertisers want, the one that everyone wants, the one that our loved ones want, our kids want, is our time. It's the one non-renewable resource. And so if a listener were to come to you and ask, like, where should I put my time? How should I figure it out? Like, what advice would you give?
One thing I think about is in some of the cases we cover, I feel like listeners sometimes do realize that what they're listening to isn't very good or may not be ethical, but there can be such a desperation to get more information or engage more with a certain case that has attracted their interest that they kind of, like, a lot of people come up to us and they're like, yeah, I know I shouldn't listen to him, but did you hear what this guy was saying? And it's kind of like, mostly rumor and nonsense, but what if it's real? And it's like, I think people just need to be able to listen to their gut when someone's getting up and ranting and being very unprofessional and posting rumors and is frequently wrong. They stick around and they kind of continue to enjoy success, at least in some cases, mostly because people watch them for the spectacle, or they, it's amusing. And I think, like, sometimes folks maybe need to just say, okay, I recognize this is kind of the junk food of true crime, and maybe I need to distance myself, because often those are the creators that end up hurting people in real life, in real ways, by either accusing somebody falsely of a crime or doxing others, or engaging in behavior that's just not really acceptable in any space. But I think a lot of people, it's funny, they know it, but they kind of are still tempted by it. And I understand that, because it's there can be something almost like reality TV-esque about some of this, but I think in general it's usually just better to walk away from it.
And I encourage people to pay attention to the track record of particular podcasts. Have they said things that have turned out to be true? They said things which then have been verified and reported on in other media sources, traditional media sources like newspapers or television? If so, then maybe give them a bit more credibility. If not, don't. Listen to how they talk about the victims. Do they treat the victims and their families with respect, or do they seem to be exploiting them or minimizing the things which might cause them pain? I think that's important as well.
One of the tricks that I'll sometimes use is I will look at a podcast feed and pick uh, an episode from an area where I've lived. And if they can nail things like geography or, all sorts of like little things, that's a tip off to me that, maybe I should give them a chance because they did some real work here. So I think there are lots of somebody in the chat made the point, like, don't underestimate your gut. I think there's probably some truth to that too. And I think, but all of those ideas, Dana, do you, any thoughts for you?
I agree with what has already been said. And I think for me, it's the victim centered story. So, aside from just being fact based, having the podcast maybe having a good reputation, like, we've talked about where we, look at their track record, look at, whether or not what they've said has come true, or do they just like to spread rumors? And I mean, you can tell by the way they title episodes, or, the way episodes are titled, the way they put out some of their social media, average, let's just say ads for their podcast, or their episodes. I mean, all of those things are part of it, because when you're building whenever you are building an episode, there are multiple pieces to doing that. And each one of those should look ethical and have some sort of focus on the victim. This isn't just a story to tell. This is a family who has suffered a loss, who, is looking for answers. And to me, that is one of the best kind of tip offs, because the podcaster is trying to help, is trying to find answers, is trying to explain a situation, is trying to educate their listeners. It's not about just clicking and listening. It's about more than that. It's about advocacy.
Right. It goes beyond the sort of sensationalism part of it. One of the cases, like Delphi, is one that I'm pretty outspoken on. And, I have opinions on all sorts of things, but this one sort of like gets under my craw for a lot of different reasons, because it's so far field from the victims. It's become so far field from the crime. And now we've gotten to the point where, in my mind, like, we're far afield from even the rights of the defendant, like even the people who are on the defense side. I do not know what's going on that end, but part of what keeps me talking about that particular case, even though it drives many people in my life crazy, is that it's a case that could really benefit from good journalism, and there's not a lot of it. So and it's similar to Idaho, and it's similar to some of the other ones. So Kevin and Áine, I was going to ask you, what's your experience been like covering the case, both in terms of sort of like covering as journalists, interacting with other creators in the broader community? Are there collaborations or learning that happens between you and other creators, conflicts? Like, what has that been like? That, because Dana and I are, I think, and you guys are probably falling into this group, part of a group of podcasters who are constantly learning from each other, growing from each other. And I'm just curious, what's the experience with that?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, it's a great question. Like,
how are you going to answer this?
I don't know. Let's see. So it's I would kind of group people differently. So there are a lot of very good local journalists who cover the case in some depth. Maybe not with the granularity that we bring, but certainly with kind of an attention to detail. And they have really welcomed us and certainly just been wonderful colleagues. So it's been a real pleasure to kind of get to know some of them and to see them work and to see different work in different media. It's very interesting. Like what makes a TV story, what makes a print story. Like I knew some of that because of my background, but seeing it kind of up close when you're at a court hearing and they're, trying to get together a shot, that's been good. And that's usually pretty collaborative. A lot of people talk to each other within the media in this space. With new media, it's a little bit, I think in the beginning, we kind of came out of nowhere with this case to a certain extent. And I think people are like, who are these people? What's going on? And so we really made an effort to, kind of be friendly with different YouTubers and kind of tried to be open with them and, maybe like let them know that we weren't, like we didn't mean any harm and like, we can all get along here. But over time, it's been more difficult as like certain elements have gotten more radicalized in the case. And we've kind of just maybe moved our energy elsewhere for the most part, because you kind of just at the end of the day, when you're running around trying to like encourage people to like, not do horribly unethical things all day, it's like, we don't need to be the police of this case. Like other people are adults, and if they're choosing to do something, bad, that's something that they're going to just do. So I think, yeah.
You made me think of like the point I think that I was making earlier about like, so when I started in journalism, had to either own a TV station or a printing press, and then you had the civic duty to only allow people to utilize it who would do good work. So those people became, it's why like, you have all those slogans like for newspapers that involve words like trust or other things along those lines. And you no longer have that, right? And you had made the comment about like giving your time and attention to the junk food of so now sort of that job, right? You guys don't want to be the police. That job sort of falls on our listeners to some extent. They have to be the ones who sort of police the space. I don't know how do they do that? Either Dana or Áine or Kevin, any?
It's hard. I mean, and when I say we don't police it, I mean more of like those personal connections where it's like, hey man, like do you really want to, put out photos that, are horrific and maybe would be devastating to the case and the families involved, so it's like, it's more like that. I think we've never been terribly quiet, and this is controversial and I understand that, but about like stuff that we don't feel is correct or right or ethically okay within true crime, we'll always say like, this is not good. And some people really don't like that because they feel it's very judgmental. It makes us look like, we're picking fights with people. We always mean it in good faith. We're not trying to bring people down, but just say like, this is not really it. This is not necessarily like what we think is acceptable, what's going on here. And that would be a way for creators to, speak out. There's like kind of a tendency within true crime, I feel, where it's like, everybody wants to swap promos. Nobody wants to like call out terrible behavior because then you're one of the haters, right? And like I get that it's not easy, but honestly, I don't know how
promos. You mean like doing advertising?
Yeah, let's advertise. Let's pat each other on the back, and it's like I think that's fine. The collaborations are fine.
I was surprised in the Delphi case, the level of vitriol between different creators if you don't agree with them. Prior to Delphi, I would say the case we were most associated with was the Burger Chef murders. That's the case that brought Áine and I together, and it's a case that's very, very close to our hearts.
What happened, Kevin? The Burger Chef murders? That's the Speedway, Indiana.
Four kids were kidnapped from a Speedway area. Burger Chef transported about 20 miles away and killed in the woods. It's an awful, awful case.
And that was
1978.
Yeah.
And this was a case that meant a great deal to us. And there are other podcasters who cover the case. I'm going to name one of them, Todd McComas. If you look him up and listen to his podcast, listen to our podcast on the case, He and Áine, we don't agree on a lot of conclusions, but we're very friendly with him. He's very friendly with us.
He's a great guy.
We all respect each other, and it's like, okay, Mr. McComas doesn't agree with us. We don't agree with him, but he's still a great guy. And so, and we can all be friends. And I thought that's what it would be like in Delphi. But in Delphi, if you don't accept one side's theories, especially when you have one side saying that there's a massive conspiracy and corruption and unprecedented evil, if you have a side believing that, and if you don't believe it with them, they think you're part of the enemy and they hate you.
I mean, it's not even about believing. It's about like, give us something that we can report, because guess what? If a journalist gets a story about like some massive conspiracy and it's true, like that is,
That's huge. That's Watergate. Right.
That's Watergate. I mean, ultimately every journalist wants Watergate. Like, you want the conspiracy to be true. You want, the parallax view. You want that. But I feel like when people can't deliver that evidence, we're not going to just assume that it is true. We're going to report both sides and let the readers, or let the listeners decide in this case. And
I remember times where we got like tips from really great sources on huge stories, some of which may be true, some of which may have made it into the news or not. But like, we would spend a year, it wasn't the full-time job for a year, but like vetting a kind of simple story or idea. That happened with the NSA domestic surveillance in the US. That was like a 3-year vetting of a excellent source who had access to the information. But there's something to be said for like the care that should go into that kind of work, which brings me to another thing I was going to ask you about, Dana. You mentioned earlier sort of like that North Star of yours being the victims. And I like to say there are 4 kinds of podcasts in true crime, but there's probably more, and there's a blend of them. But there are journalistic ones, there are advocacy ones, there are analytical ones, there are entertainment ones, and many crossover. They fit into more than one bucket. I was going to ask whether you thinking of it from a journalism perspective and ethics perspective, true crime perspective, however you want to frame it, is there something from journalism or related to the truth that needs to be a part of all of those podcasts?
I mean, idealistically, I say yes. From my own perspective, I would say yes. But I also realize that there are people out there who, aren't walking the same path that I'm walking. What is interesting to me, what is ethical to me, it may not be what's ethical to them or feels interesting to them. And so I don't, when you were talking, Anya, about policing, I 100% agree with the way you explained that when there's misinformation or facts are being distorted, and it's about the case or the victim or could be harmful, then as a content creator, I would step in. But otherwise, I throw my hands up and say, if you want to listen to a podcast that, my favorite or not is not banter at the beginning. I like diving directly in and just having like the facts and the story. Other people really enjoy that. If you want that, you should be allowed, if someone's creating it, by all means, you do not have to feel guilty about that. My only hope is that creator is mixing banter and humor in the right way and is just remaining victim focused, who understands that this is a real story, real people, real families, that we are not just we're not creating entertainment. And I do think, it can be entertaining if it's done the right way, if that's what you're looking for.
Right.
For me, I don't know that I'm creating super entertaining podcasts. I'm not trying to be entertaining. I'm trying to be educational. I'm trying to be factual. I'm trying to, get FOIA documents that might and release some information that might bring a tip. Like that is literally, I'm trying to give the families a voice. So when they want to speak, I'm giving them my platform to do that. So that's my way of thinking. But by all means, I am not, the end all be all of podcasting. And I don't want to direct to others what they should enjoy.
No, and I think there's, even taking that point, you may not be creating entertainment, and how we never can control how our listeners feel about it, whether it's entertaining or informative or educational for them. But even if you are creating entertainment, and I think that's the challenge with so many of the documentaries, is that the line is really blurry. When I, Jason Blair, go see a documentary, I expect the truth. I expect you not to shade it. I expect you to have context. I actually expect ridiculous rigor, but that's me, Jason Blair, where I'm coming from. It's a shame I don't run the world, but
I would fit right into your world, Jason.
What are you talking about? See? All right. Maybe that's the real answer. We're having the wrong conversation. It's about journalism. It should be about running the world. And you know what, guys? Any of you can be in charge. I'm cool with whatever role you need me in. No, but part of what I was seriously thinking about was, in this world, whether it's entertainment, whether you as the creator view it as entertainment or you view it as advocacy, I think it's a reasonable expectation for everyone that you did the best job you could to get to the truth before you opened your mouth. Right?
Yes.
I mean, and I think part of the problem, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about this, is that the world we live in right now, where 60 Minutes isn't the only show coming on once a week, and they don't have a week or months to work on their stories, and the newspaper isn't daily, and YouTube channels can go live immediately, and there's social media, that everything incentivizes the world around us, whether it's the business you're motivated by, or it's the recognition you're motivated by, or whatever your motive is, it's incentivized by doing it faster, getting ahead of people, breaking things. Like I have friends who are podcasters. They are not journalists, but they all think they're breaking news journalists right now. And I'm like, why don't you stick to the analysis? Because maybe you'll be better at that. But what I will tell you is you will not be any good at a news conference or reporting out the details of a court hearing. But I think everybody's incentivized to play that game of being first, and some are, just not equipped for it. But the problem becomes the first voice out there tends to sort of carry the tide, and the second voice is busy rebutting the first voice and not even sort of telling the truth. So it creates this whole mess for people. And I think we're kind of contributing to that splitting. That's just my general. I love to hear what you guys think about that piece of it.
I think that was really well said. I think, gosh, it's not just always the first voice. Sometimes it's the loudest or most sensationalist voice.
Yep.
And I think a lot of the environment, even when instances where maybe someone's not intending to cause harm or spread misinformation, maybe through lack of knowledge or maybe through rushing, there's a lot of sloppiness. And one thing I think back of when I was, at a traditional news outlet, when I remember writing a story where I got the victim's age wrong by a year. So I said that they were 18 and they were 17. And I will never forget this. I talked, the sister of the victim talked, and she said, she was 17. And the reason that affects her is because this girl was about to turn 18. She never got to turn 18. She was it was almost her birthday when she was killed. And it was like, oh God, those details really matter. Because these people matter, these victims matter to their families, and they should matter to everybody. And so there is a real harm that can be done through sloppiness and through lack of care. And I would just also add to this, I think truth is important. we don't know always know what the truth is. We don't always
Right.
know where that lands. Other people might have different versions
I
of the
would I
truth.
would even argue we never know it. It's like a constant
Yeah.
thing we're striving for. It's
But
really
we can
frustrating.
be fair. We can be fair. And this is where people don't dig, and that's where it's a problem. And they, I remember like, people would always like I would do these retail stories, and one thing people would always complain about is like, why are there no cashiers in Walmart? And like I would get like reader questions like, look into that. Like, are they just all hanging out in the back room? And like you talk to the Walmart cashiers, and they're like, they're only putting one of us on shift. Like they're not hiring more. They're trying to push everyone to this automated system.
Mhm.
And so people are coming into this with this assumption that it's the Walmart employees' fault and
Please.
that it's they're lazy or they're not doing their jobs. And the reality is that structurally, they're behind the eight ball, and it's not fair to them to come in with the assumption that they're doing something wrong. So like journalism is just it's always like that. You always come in with some sort of maybe people are assuming something or you're assuming something, and then you look into it and it is so complicated.
Mhm.
And reporting it as complicated and nuanced rather than boiling it down for easy consumption, I think is really important. Let it be messy, and the listeners are smart, and they can kind of grapple with it themselves and come down where they feel they want to come down, but you don't need to like kind of wrap it up for them in a neat little bow at all times.
Yeah, there's this constant, uh, human sort of like drive to fit everything into a nice narrative. I always inherently, if you give me a really nice narrative, I'm like, I don't trust this.
Yeah.
It's too easy. I've been living on this planet long enough to know it's never that clean, right? It's never the hero's journey. It's never Anakin becoming Darth Vader and then slaying or getting, Luke, whatever. It's never the hero's journey. It's always more messy and complicated and has peaks and valleys. And then I will trust if you can tell me that story. I want to take a couple listener questions, but I wanted to ask you guys before we go and do that. Um, a lot of true crime creators come from varying backgrounds, and they might be interested with you guys coming from sort of, Kevin as a lawyer, definitely critical thinking space, and now I'm going to officially call you a journalist, and I as a journalist, and also Dina as a researcher and a journalist. Yes, I have mad respect for your journalism, Kevin. Actually, I am. Yeah, the since they come from such varying backgrounds and areas of expertise, but still have to do some element of sort of reporting and research, what ideas would you have for them in terms of preparing to kind of be successful and ethical and impactful in this environment? Like, what can you do?
So I'm just going to go first, and I'm going to use my research background. So as a librarian, I taught information literacy skills to students at a university. And one of the things that we talk about is triangulating. So I use that all the time, especially today with the internet so crammed full of misinformation or SEO based information that makes it very hard to find. Like in 2007, it was easy to find information, and now it's just you're wading through a sea of stuff. And finding the facts can sometimes be very difficult. So, what I would suggest is you don't want you want to if you're looking at newspaper articles for your research, try to find three different articles that at least say the same thing, and try starting back at the very beginning, because over time it's like a game of telephone sometimes where someone misreports something like the age of a victim, and that gets misreported for over and over and over again. So to me, it's really going back to the very beginning and trying to get that information from the start. Did it change? Is it accurate? And then, triangulating that, like I said, with at least three different sources. And sometimes that source can be a family member or someone who's very active in the case or an expert. So I think that, that's one little tip that I would have as far as, like a tool you can use, because sometimes that's really what we need are tools. We kind of have the general idea of how to do it, but we're missing just a tool that might help us get past that hump or over a mistake that we're making. Because I've seen many cases where just that one piece of information keeps getting reported incorrectly over and over, and then it becomes like the gospel in the case, and it's
Mhm.
very sad when that happens.
Well, and that's actually, to that point, I'm curious because I've always thought like, I, go back to find an original source, right? Find something that's an original source, and you'll often find out what those errors are and have the opportunity to correct them. But as a researcher, like, what's the barrier for you for publishing? It's obviously not that you read it in the newspaper.
I mean, I think that it's a very difficult. It's a very hard place to be, because, you can't question everything. And so at some point you have to just commit. I think that the way I've covered stories is that I, really do try to get something in print, have my facts ready, and then who can I talk to verify this? So I usually would like some verification from someone, um, other than just a print source or a story, a blog post or something like that. So I'm always looking for a way to verify information. I've called law enforcement, I've talked to family members. I really try to bring it into the present and have somebody be able to say, yes, this is accurate information to report.
That makes sense to me. Kevin, Anya, any of
Uh,
your sort of
you mentioned you're kind of talking about me having allegedly good critical thinking skills. I will tell you, I will be honest here, and I will tell you the very embarrassing thing that I think taught me more about critical thinking than anything else. And this is deeply humiliating. I, for a while, was totally obsessed with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Just completely over the top obsessed with it to certainly an unhealthy extent.
So that's all John F. Kennedy assassination.
There's a
books.
case back there just full of books.
is that where
So,
the stuff is leaning?
yes.
Appropriate.
So over the course of I think a year or two, at some point in my life, I read about 150 books on it, and doing that taught me a lot because if somebody was arguing, oh, it's the lone assassin, or if someone was arguing that, oh, it was a conspiracy, they would not be presenting all the facts. They would be leaving things out. They would be tailoring it a certain way in order to let people reach a certain conclusion.
Theory.
And so that enabled me to see that in other cases where I could read books and say, oh, this is like that book in the JFK case that left this out or did it this way. And I think for a long time, I had some frankly wrong conclusions about that JFK case. And it was because I was being fed dishonest or distorted information. And so it's very frustrating to me today. I think a lot of people in the Delphi case, quite frankly, well-meaning, intelligent, thoughtful people, I think they have strong opinions about the case that are based on intentional misinformation. Like some of the things in the books I used to read on JFK were intentionally misleading to make people reach a certain conclusion.
And
Also,
so maybe sometimes in those moments, right, where that pressure is to publish this great piece of information that the source gave me, the real answer might be hold back and do some more and figure it out. They always told us at every newspaper I worked at, which is like, if it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Anya, you were going to say?
oh, I was going to say also people should remember that oftentimes conspiracy sells, like the more compelling narrative sells better. And, there can be economic reasons to doing things certain ways. If it's not always innocent. I would say for me, the key thing, and this kind of touches a bit upon what Dana was saying, but like human beings, like if you can talk to a human being, and that could be somebody who has experience within a case, an attorney who worked on the case, a police officer, a victim's family member, absolutely talk to them. If you can talk to a journalist who covered it in the past, if you can just talk to somebody from that small town that you've never been to and don't have the ability to go to, but who can tell you what it was like back then or what it's like now and how it's changed. If you can talk to, I mean, this is kind of silly. We did an episode about like a tavern homicide from the 1700s. So obviously we're not going to be interviewing anyone for that.
Did you find
But-
a source?
Yeah,
Witness?
Rip Van Winkle was available for comment. No, we did talk to some wonderful professors, including one from Notre Dame, who actually happens to specialize in basically disabilities in the 18th century. What did that look like, and what would that So we were able. You can always find someone who has some perspective on it, and you have to just be creative about how you go with that. But more than that, like, there's a human side to everything. One of the first episode we ever made, I think I stumbled across it in newspapers.com, and it was a story about how two robbers were robbing a brothel/restaurant in Reading, Pennsylvania, and they held hostages. Then they were leaving with the loot, and police showed up. The police, one of the robbers shot at the police. Police fire back, and that robber is killed. His friend survives and then is charged with felony murder.
Felony murder.
Right.
Which is murder. You didn't necessarily pull the trigger, but because you committed another felony that contributed to the murder, you're responsible for it.
This was actually one of the cases in our first test episode where I was just talking about it as an example of felony murder. And then when we decided to do the podcast a different way, we actually found the man's son.
Yeah, we tracked down the man's son, and he just told us the most like beautiful story where this man eventually his conviction on felony murder, I believe, was overturned, and he eventually got out, and he became a volunteer firefighter in his community. He married, he had a child, he had a life, he had friends. He was like close with like members of like a band that kind of got sort of big in the 90s. Like, he was like a guy in his community who meant so much to people. And this man was telling us about like how he has all these fond memories of him and his father going out to like a little lake cabin they had, and like, just like all these like beautiful memories, and like what a beautiful life that even though it came out of this, bad action, ultimately he was able to make good and help other people in life. And it just made us realize like this would have been fine to do as just kind of a little footnote of like, wow, what a weird felony murder case, huh?
Mhm.
But like we would have been missing so much.
Something so powerful, beautiful, and unexpected, right?
Yeah, just like what a story of redemption. And like, I mean, and like I just think about that all the time, because you never know unless you talk to people, things like that.
Yeah, and until you look, you're right. Yeah, and I think it's the same with Dana's work. You never know what you're going to find unless you're willing to make that extra effort. It said, I had an editor who was like, whenever you feel like a story is done, keep on going, take another step, keep on pushing, because that's when you're going to find the real story. And that, I think that's a powerful example of that. For those of you who don't know about Dana's work at True Crime P.I, the Cobb County Jane Doe case, I'm betting you didn't walk into that thinking you'd get as far as you've gotten, and definitely worth listening to. I won't spoil it, and hopefully there'll be more news on that soon. But first, guys, Dana, Áine, Kevin, I'm going to first show you some nice things people have been saying about you all. So we've got Carly talking about meeting Dana at the Atlanta podcast. Awesome in person and on her podcast. Everybody, you guys would love her content.
Oh.
I totally agree with that. I think that I couldn't agree more with the comment, because I also met you at that event. We've got a nice Jason comment, shockingly, about being honest about mistakes. I try to do that, and Jessica, the part of the reason why I try to do that is to make it easier for other people to be open about their own mistakes and heal and talk about those things. So for Kevin and Áine, where's the one that I flagged one for you
A bunch
guys.
of hate messages pop up.
While you're looking for that, let me say you had a comment there from Jessica, and we were talking about researchers and research. And Jessica is like one of the best researchers I've ever met.
I do agree.
She is incredible. And so if there's someone out there who's thinking about doing some kind of a podcast and you're unsure if you have the chops to do all the research yourself, Jessica has a research skill, and she works with podcasts, just the facts. So she is an incredible researcher.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. You have my full endorsement. I've seen her work. I think I've told almost everyone that I possibly could tell. The one of the ones too about all of us, Sophie makes the point that she likes that the discussion isn't about a specific case and that it's more broad, because I think we're really trying to tackle the issue as opposed to any particular case. We've got one question up here for that I'll throw out to you guys. Has ethical journalism gone off the rails? We see it in Delphi, Idaho, and Lisk also.
I don't know. I think there's always ethical journalists out there trying to do their best. I just think that sometimes the internet can be a bit of a wild west, so a lot of the noise gets amplified. And honestly, the best thing we can all do is most of the time ignore it, or educate ourselves and each other, and help remind each other that it's best to focus on the people doing good work.
Okay. This is another one for you, Áine. And a couple comments like this came up asking about whether misogyny plays a role in your work.
Anytime I talk about or touch upon this on the podcast, we get a bunch of mad, angry emails, so I'm nervous. But
I'm looking forward to them.
Yeah, I think like. I guess, yeah, I've noticed that. A lot of people seem to like really have an issue with me in particular between the two of us sometimes. And I mean, some of that may just be they don't like my personality and it's not misogynistic. So I'm not saying I'm above criticism, but sometimes it takes on a tone and tenor that kind of feels a bit like, wait, you're mad that I have an opinion, or you're mad that I'm stating what I think? Like, and that kind of, I think sometimes people might have that internalized and not necessarily realize that that's where it's coming from. They might it's just an instinct. But I think sometimes there can be that with female creators in true crime. I remember seeing stuff like where somebody was like, this was almost a good podcast, but there's a woman in it. Like, I didn't remember that.
I remember that.
Yeah,
love that. Honest,
What's up with this?
I think I mentioned that we get some comments about our looks. I think Áine gets more of that because I think a lot of men have the view that their opinion of what a woman looks like really should mean something. And that the ultimate thing you can say against a woman is that I don't find it attractive somehow. And so we get messages like that all the time about Áine in particular. It's not really appropriate. I think it's misogyny.
Yeah, and it's like I was just assuming like it's an audio space, so I won't have to worry about that. that was not the case, unfortunately. No, and it kind of makes me regret ever appearing on camera ever on the internet.
But I think honestly, I mean, like it is unfortunate that people do that, but those are the kinds of things I think somebody had made the point in the chat that are like a sign for me that you're not a serious person. If you have to resort to name calling, doxing, all of those kinds of things, then in my mind, I know it's harder for you guys because Kevin and Áine don't have my gift of like instantly not caring. I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. Right. But I think sometimes those can just be tip-offs, whether it's creators or listeners or people who giving reviews, like when it doesn't make sense, when it's not in context, why does it matter anymore? Anyone who's going to look at that and take it seriously, you probably don't you're going to lose them anyway at some point. So, someone made the point. We got Boren James 79. I consume a lot of media that's created by people I don't agree with. I think that is a great point. One of the things for me, when I was at the Boston Globe, when I was working in the Washington Bureau, David Shribman, who's the editor there, he threw on my first day of the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal on my desk. And he's like, I want you to read all the political stories that are in front. I want you to read the editorial pages of all these papers. They're all going to disagree. They're all going to pull out different facts that are more important. And by combining that, you're going to get closer to the truth. I started reading the Wall Street Journal editorials. I was like, oh, this is killing me. This is killing me. But over time, I was like, okay, now I understand the different perspectives and I can see things through different lenses. So I think there's something definitely true. And I definitely do that in books too, like where I totally disagree with theories. And that can be a helpful way but the one thing I would say is you can't weigh all of it equally. You've got to come up with your own system for weighing each of the different perspectives. So let me see what else we have in here.
Can I just read a comment that says, and I 100% agree with Sophie on this, and she said, I feel like men/women do that when they have nothing else to say. It's like a low-hanging fruit to insult someone's looks. And I think that is like, it really does. It's like you're empty, like you're empty of thought, you're empty of creativity, you're empty of, being able to make a decent argument or have a conversation. Like, to
I call
me,
it
that's
the crutch of fools, right?
Yes.
Like
yes.
it's what fools fall on when
Yes.
nothing else to do.
Yes.
Yeah, and these people are fooling themselves because, like, I already think I look terrible, so don't worry about it. Like, I can't go any lower here.
You're beautiful.
But no, I think what you're saying is true. I think anything that's more of an ad hominem, that's not about the work. I think as creators, we can all agree that sometimes we deserve criticism, or sometimes things need to get better. We do something that's not up to snuff, or people might have a different opinion on that, and that kind of feedback is very helpful. I think even
it's awesome. I love it.
Yes, it's like that always, I feel like, comes from a place of just it's not even caring.
I remember getting my first 1-star review and I was like, yes, you are right. I do need to fix that. You are spot on.
Thank you, sir.
Finally, someone said it out loud.
Yeah.
But this other stuff, and I think that there's an important caveat I want to put on it. You're right. Like, I tend to write it off fairly quickly, but at age 26, 27, however old I was at that point, getting attacked for all sorts of wild things, I learned over time to just let go of it. But I also want to say, just more broadly to people, even though I can look at those kinds of insults, like gender-based ones or appearance-based ones, and I can write them off in my head. It doesn't mean that for a lot of people, or certainly when it first started to happen to me, it hurt. I knew how illogical it was, but it actually hurt. And, just because I guess I'm saying that we should be able to sort of like work to get those comments to roll off our backs, it doesn't mean that they don't hurt. And I think just from sort of looking at it from a moral perspective and looking at it from what are you trying to accomplish when you're insulting people like this? Like, do you get pleasure from just causing people hurt? Because it does hurt. It really does truly hurt, even though we know it's foolish. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Jessica, you were saying, Jessica was making the point that comments about her also hurt her. They found out, right? And I think there's a lot of that too in the space in general, and that's something I think all of us can encourage, and Kevin and I run into this problem all the time. Dana, I don't know if you do. I have a natural tendency, actually, Kevin and Áine, you guys don't have this natural tendency to combat every stupid thing that's said about anyone I care about. And so I called Kevin and Áine last night and I was like, I want to fight these people to death. And then I realized all I was doing was amplifying them. So sometimes it's best to just ignore. So everyone, don't follow my model.
There's social media I don't go on anymore because I'm just like, nope, not today. Not today, Satan, like I'm not. Because it's like whatever benefit would be, it's just not worth it.
See, the people agree with me.
Thank you. You're very kind.
I also agree.
Well, but it's more of like it's just, well, thank you, but like it's no. You're making this
Is it hard for you to come?
I want to know. We could have like a 2-hour live just be talking about how.
I'm gonna run out of here.
But never gonna come on again.
You guys are very sweet. It's more of like I would hate to think that like some young woman especially would come into this space and then be subjected to that, because it's I mean, I have my husband here, so if I'm getting mean emails, he can be like, no, you're super cute, and I'm like, yeah. But if it's someone who's like just like starting out and like they happen to piss somebody off, and it's just not necessary. Like it's just and I think unfortunately I feel like a lot of this goes back to like an anti-fandom sort of that can happen in the internet. Like you can't just like, oh, I like Taylor Swift, or I don't really care for Taylor Swift. Like if you hate Taylor Swift, then there's like groups for that, and you can like Taylor Swift and say how much she sucks. And it's like, I understand the impulse because everyone likes to sort of dish and like talk about people they don't like. But I think like what the internet does is it kind of amplifies that too much to the point where I don't think it's healthy for the people who are doing it necessarily at a certain point. And certainly with like random true crime creators, like we're not that important. If you're obsessing over us in a negative way, like you probably could be doing something that's more fun and productive, I think.
I don't understand. Like for instance, I was talking about comic books earlier. There's a comic book inker now deceased named Vinnie Coletta, who I think is by far the worst comic book inker who ever lived.
He hates his inking.
His work is a disgrace. But it would never occur to me, if Mr. Coletta was still alive, to be going online and saying, oh, Mr. Coletta doesn't look too good personally, does he? Or post his address or things like that. All I would say...
He must be stopped.
All I would say is he's a really bad inker. So I don't understand why you can't just say that, why you have to talk about more personal attacks. I honestly don't understand that.
Welcome to my life. It's all about this Coletta man and his poor inking.
I know. I love it. I love it. This is why I love it, among the many reasons. But one of the things that I think Mallory makes a really good point here, and then it's echoed by a couple other people in the chat. She makes the point that for every troll, there are 10 people beside you who have your back, show up for you, and love you. And, Robert makes the point, we have a great group of people who support us. That's one thing about the attacks. One of the beauties of the attacks has been, and not just the attacks, I mean, even just the tough things about being a podcaster, the difficult things, being open about it or being attacked has brought so much love and compassion. For as frustrated as I am about things that happen in this space, the amount of love that I see in this space from listeners, from podcasters and other creators is kind of, it's amazing to me. And I actually think, Kevin, that's how we first started communicating, right? You reached out to me after I had written a note about, I forget what it was. Was it about Adnan or?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. When the prosecutors were doing a big series on Adnan, and there was going to be lots of controversy over it. I was encouraging the prosecutors' listeners, hey, give grace to the people who disagree or who get mad or who, people are passionate about these things, but I see so much love in the groups. Whether it's when someone's being attacked, or Dana, you and I have had this experience when we're just like feeling alone in the work that we're doing. So those are
Brett from the prosecutors posted something in Facebook the other day that meant a great deal to us. So we really do appreciate people having our back, and it was a wonderful thing that came at the right time and meant a great deal to us.
Yeah, those are moving moments. What is down there talking about? Jason gets very frustrated. Yes, she is correct.
Yeah.
Yes. They poor Lily is a part of a group chat that I'm in where I say what I actually think about people attacking you guys.
I would just, I think it's just energy that's misspent for most people. I don't even know if they really think about it as far as like causing harm necessarily all the time. I think it's just like, it's not real because it's on the internet, and let's just do whatever. And I think, maybe some of the energy can be more productively spent. And I guess one thing that just concerns me about all this in a macro sense is that I feel like a lot of the ongoing high profile cases will just continue to be like this unless there really is a cultural shift. And what I love about what Dana is doing and what some of the things you've said about your work is that like you are focusing on the cases that need the attention and are not getting blasted with attention. And I feel like those are some of the cases that may be less controversial, but it feels like everything that even just kind of slips into the spotlight for a minute nowadays, everybody has to come out with an instant opinion. And it obfuscates a lot because half the time it's just like better to wait until we have more information or until both sides present at trial. And this is what we try to tell people in Delphi. It's just like people like, what do you think? Do you think he's guilty? Do you think he's innocent? And my honest answer is like, you shouldn't care what we think. Like it's not our job to pass judgment. And we have not had an opportunity to see both arguments. We've just gotten previews, and therefore we don't feel comfortable stating, anything because we just don't know.
To your point, right? Like creators are beginning to impact the cases. You've got the case in Massachusetts that we were talking about where he's been charged with witness intimidation. You have situations in Delphi related to the contempt leak and the leak of the photos, which is still happening. I don't know that most people know that a creator released the photos on Friday on a YouTube channel of the crime scene with the girls, and also sent the photos to their family members. But these things that people are doing are really affecting the outcomes. They're hurting the families. They don't serve their listeners either. So, and I'm giving extreme examples, but there are also less extreme examples. And I guess we vote with our ears, right? Like we vote with our eyeballs. And are we going to support this? Or are we going to support people who are doing work like you, Dana, and your colleagues, Lexi and Andrea, on the Seeking Justice effort, or your True Crime podcast? P.I. I think of it the same way. Like my work may not always be the most interesting. You might be bored halfway through my interview, but you're going to get like the best honest me and the best honest my guest. And I'm happy with that piece of it.
Yeah. We interviewed 2 lawyers today, and they were like, well, we really appreciate you asking us on, but I think we're going to bore your listeners stiff because, we're just going to be talking about some legal
for the course, man.
We were like, no, we had a guy on who just talked about oral arguments like not so long ago. And they were like, what? Are you sure you're a true crime podcast? And it's like, our listeners love this because they're learning along with us, like nuance, and what all this means. And it's more of an educational thing than just like blood splatter everywhere. And I think I know Dana said something about this earlier, but I've come to, in the beginning, I was always sort of like, oh, I don't really know how I feel about like more comedic or entertainment based podcasts. But I I think there is a way to do that in a very ethical, respectful manner, and that they can be incredibly cathartic for listeners, like who we live in a scary world, and if you can kind of like have the experience of like almost feeling like you're among friends, having a fun conversation, and also learning something about crime, there's nothing wrong with that. It's like there's no one type of podcast that's wrong somehow. It's anyone can go wrong.
Any of them can.
Right.
Yes. And it's like if you just need a bit of a foundation of like truth, fairness, understanding, and that should be the platform on which all are built, as opposed to singling out one as somehow like lesser than. If that makes sense.
All right, folks. If nobody else in our audience has questions, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you guys. Just thinking about the conversation once again, as always, not what I expected, which I love it when it goes that way. That is my favorite kind of conversation. But I was just thinking overall in the start of this conversation, like, you guys, we're all different in terms of what we do and the type of work, but I think that there's probably some a shared thread of wanting to be able to help people, to educate people, to inform people in the work that we want to do, to leave the world a better place. And even this isn't the core topic. I wanted to ask you, all three of you, before we leave, with all these difficulties and all these hard things that we're dealing with in this space, what is it inside you? What value is it that drives you to continue to do the work? I know for me, it's that one person who listens to one line in my podcast and tells me that it's somehow easier for them to get up in the morning or whatever it is. It's that one person a week for me. That's what it is. It's that one person, like all of the rest, you can hate it, but that one person. And I'm just wondering like I hold on to that person during the week. Like when I don't want to do an interview or I don't want to do X, Y, or Z, or I want to burn down all social media. What is it that keeps you guys going? And that's true. If I could, you'd wake up one day and you'd be like, what happened to social media?
Well, I would say one thing for me is it's the audience, something similar to what you said. And more specifically, it's really been rewarding. When we first started the show, we tried to be extra, extra serious and professional. And so people always said we were like Charles Emerson Winchester from MASH. We were very snotty. and so we tried to get more of our personality and stuff in there. And we've started doing every week a casual episode where we talk about current cases that we don't usually cover, just do little things we read about online and talk about them. And what's interesting to me about that is we're spotlighting cases that aren't really getting covered, except for little stories here and there that maybe people don't notice. And we get emails from people whose stories we've covered in these cheat sheet episodes, and it means something to them. And I'll say one of the stories we covered involved fentanyl. And we got a ton of email from people saying, thank you for talking about fentanyl. It's really an awful crisis. And so we've started covering more and more fentanyl. At the end of a recent episode of Cheat Sheet, I told some story about how I felt awkward in a particular social situation. And we got emails from people saying, even just showing that vulnerability made them feel better, made them feel seen. So it's touching people in ways you don't expect.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say like I love to make people feel less alone. Like when we hear from people who are like, I went through something, and we talk to so many people like off the record that it's not going to be ever part of the show or cited or anything, but it's just like we've heard from people who've told their story on our show or just behind the scenes, and then they've reached out to us and said, this was incredibly cathartic for me, having some kind of conversation and owning the story and like being able to tell it. And that's helped with my healing. And like if we can do that, or if we can publicize a missing person case where the family's looking for somebody, or if we can talk about a case where a victim was, shamed and treated horribly by the press back in the 70s, and sort of note that that's terrible. I mean, if we can just do some of these things, I feel like we're doing our job, and that keeps me going.
It's worth it, right? It's worth it. Yeah, I get that. Like, one of my most powerful conversations I've had as a part of this podcast was with a woman who will never come on this podcast. She has a ton of social anxiety. Her brother it's an unsolved murder, but we ended up talking for like 3 hours, and it was a meaningful conversation for her, a meaningful conversation for me. About 10 minutes in the conversation, I knew she should never, in my opinion, go on a podcast to talk about the case. But that was, I had Brianna Maitland's dad, Bruce Maitland's, on. For me, that episode was powerful, but it's that hour-long conversation with him the week before we did the episode, like where we got to both bare our hearts to each other. Like, and sometimes I forget about that. It's not just the one person. Sometimes it's the healing that happens with your guest or your source, or for your source or somebody, Dana, that you're working on, you're like, to them, the only other person who cares.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it has been twofold. So in researching Cobb County Jane Doe, I became very good friends with Detective John Dawes. He was on our show 2 weeks ago. He was a homicide and cold case detective in Cobb County, Georgia for 34 and a half years. But there's a real respect and friendship. He's taught me so much. And, he'll say, you keep me going, because I invite him to talk about cases and to look at autopsy reports and of cases that I'm working on, and give him an opportunity to do what he loves, and that is help families. And I think that's the other side of it for me, is that whether I'm giving myself hope, if I'm telling a doe story, I'm giving myself hope that this doe could be identified someday. And then if she gets close to being identified, or I meet the family, then I know I've given them hope and answers. And really, I think that's what it boils down to. Sometimes I feel like I'm doing it for me, because there isn't a family associated when you're covering a doe case. You don't know until after your work has made a difference.
Yeah.
So,
and it might be that other listener who has something that they think may not even be related to crime, that is never going to be fixed or never going to be solved. Mm-hmm. And that if there can be hope in that case, then there can be hope for them. That seems to be maybe the common thread of what we're all saying. We want to give people something to hold on to. We want to give them hope. And I am just going to say, listeners, we love you guys. Or at least I do. I can't speak for them. I do.
We wouldn't be here without them. So.
Right. And with that, thank you for sticking with us. And I will see you guys sometime soon. I don't know when the next live for us is, but before I go, check out Kevin and Áine at the Murder Sheet. Big part of what they do is cover Delphi, but their cheat sheet's great. They've just started a book club over in their Patreon, and a read sheet episode that I really love. So I recommend all of you guys check them out. And then Dana at True Crime P.I, and also Seeking Justice, which is investigating Don Pacella's death. And I am very hopeful that once they finish Don's case, that will not be the last we see of Seeking Justice, because it is doing journalism on the internet in this true crime creative space in a way that we don't see much anymore. So, all right, guys, be good. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.